session about online engagement and planning. And what we have in common with Metric West is that we work together, our firm and their firm, on a project called 750, 7 Counties, 50 Years, it's a regional plan for Southeast Florida. I'm going to show you a little bit about that. Jason will fill in on the ways in which online media were employed to try and enhance citizen involvement. He's going to give you some of the good and the bad and the ugly about what came from that. And then Dave is going to describe the Metric West tool. He'll talk to you some more about subjects Jason and I raised, and then make, we are told, a major announcement from Metric West. So thank you all again for coming, and we'll get started. 7 counties, 50 years. You know, when we say 7 counties in Southeast Florida, that's everything that goes from Sebastian Inlet and the Vero Beach area down through the Keys to Key West. And we describe coastal Southeast Florida as one economic unit that's integrated with regard to transportation and a whole series of shared issues along the coast, including sea level rise. People don't seem too surprised. When we say 50 years, they often do a double take and say, what? 50 years? That's so long, we can't visualize, we don't understand. So we began this project by showing folks pictures of that region 50 years ago, in 1962, 63, and then how those areas had changed in a period of dramatic growth. And then we explained to them that another period of dramatic growth is upon us. We have a little over 6 million people now in the 7 counties, and are projected, even in the post-recession adjusted projections, to be above 9 million people in 2060. And so the question really is, how are we going to accommodate that growth? In the old model, which you can kind of tell from the drawing here, the old model was to start from the coast and just leak inward. A gradual displacement of farmland and the Everglades for more and more pavement to accommodate a growing population during the great period of suburban sprawl in which all of our other metropolitan areas in the United States experienced something similar. Well, now we are much more realistic about our boundaries. The Everglades National Park and the preserve areas, the Everglades Restoration Project, the single largest environmental restoration effort in the history of the world, taking place on our western boundary, and Biscayne National Park in the Atlantic Ocean on our eastern boundary. We don't have the choice that we once thought we had to just spread into the land in order to accommodate growth. So the next 3 million people will have to be accommodated more or less in the communities we've already got, and in a much more contained amount of new land development. So to give you an idea how we're changing, in 1980, we hit the point where Miami-Dade County was the one county that had over 50% people of color. We now live in a county where about 80% of the people speak a language other than English at home. But the future looks quite a bit different. The year 2040 will hit over 50% in 4 of the counties. And so the nature of the place is changing in terms of numbers, but it's also changing in terms of who's there and how they live and how they look at the world. Not surprisingly, the world built to date in that region is a very auto-centric, Sunbelt kind of typical place, in which a tiny percent of the trips are made by walking, biking, or using transit or carpooling, and the vast majority of trips involve driving. And to that, we add the mix of sea level rise. We have a very, very small regional causation of emissions. For example, most of our electricity is produced using natural gas instead of burning coal, things like that. So we're not the biggest contributors, although we have a lot of ways we could get our act improved. We're not the biggest contributors to the greenhouse gas effect and global warming, but we are definitely on the front lines of places that will feel the effects, including sea level rise. So what does that mean? Well, if you take a place like in the Florida Keys, and you picture the way that exists today on the kind of wafer-thin land, and then what that would be like with 4 feet of sea level rise. Or what that would be like with 8 feet of sea level rise. And so, of course, the numbers change frequently, and there's plenty of calls for alarm in all the latest numbers. It really isn't a matter of whether we will have sea level rise, but how we will have it. And so 750, the regional plan, has to look very close up at issues like how we change our transportation pattern and how we build on the land in order to sustain ourselves in these impacts. There are a series of different ways sea level rise is accommodated by the plan, but that's not the only issue. In the end, the super regional plan covers these 6 important priorities. Number 5 being the one about sea level rise, but this is not the typical land use and transportation plan we might have all grown up assuming was the contents of a regional plan, but something bigger than that. Now, when we began, speaking of online engagement, we couldn't really begin online until we rethought the name. Believe it or not, what's now called 750 was originally called the South Florida Regional Vision and Blueprint for Economic Prosperity for the next 50 years. One of our colleagues pointed out was a lot like the Pan-Asian Pacific Co-Prosperity Sphere. Have you ever heard of that? That's because Japanese Empire during World War II was a much better brand name. No kidding. So they changed the name of that, and we changed the name of 750. We actually brought in some experts that on naming and branding, and spent a few weeks considering all sorts of different possible names, and simplified it to 750, and then began the online discussion.
So we were going to host a very difficult conversation with the region, the expanding population, the diversifying demographics, sea level rise, the Florida boom-bust economy. And in order to have that conversation effectively, we had to engage as many people as possible. We had a 5-part communications program, and each one of these pieces had an online interactive tool. So there was the identity and the branding that Victor talked about, 750, digital communications. We had a series of events over the 2.5 years of the project. We were in the newspapers and on TV all the time. And I think because of those things, we were actually able to put out the very interesting interactive tools like Dave will show you, and people would spend time. They'd spend a few hours on a Saturday on our website. And it was largely because of all the momentum that we had built through all the other different processes. Our website kind of looked to me like a slot machine. There were levers you could pull, and there were buttons that you could press, and there was continuous feed, and the idea was every time you went to the website, it would look a little different. And so there was a calendar that was updated, we had a scenario model that people could engage in, online polls, there was discussion groups, and we had changing headlines continually. And it kind of worked. The average online visit was about 4 minutes, which is not bad. It's enough to read a few headlines, to peruse some of the plain graphics, and to actually take part in a couple polls or things of that kind. By the end of the project, we created a second website. This website is actually the report itself. So you could read the report just by perusing the website. We broke it into all its component pieces. And the report is thus, by being online, it's kind of a living document. So there was still the snapshot. You could still download the 750 report, which nice bound copy, a PDF. But ideally, you would engage it just by browsing the website. Thus, we avoided, the old adage about the plan that sits on the shelf by not really having a plan that a shelf or by not really having a plan or a shelf, I guess is what you could say. Thank you. We had a Facebook page. We tried to send Facebook posts once a week. the typical age for viewing on the Facebook using Google Analytics was between 35 to 45, right? You can imagine a gap there. So we also use Twitter. And Twitter we use differently. On Twitter we tried to send something out every single day. The way this worked is our media consultant would send 3 or 4 posts, the things we wanted to advertise, the messages we wanted to get out, and then we would supplement that by participating in events around the region, tweeting different quotes that we got from people. Sometimes when it got slow, we would just open up the almanac of things that happened in Southeast Florida. You know, Southeast Florida was discovered on this day by Ponce de Leon, or something like that, just to make sure that every day there was a tweet. And this was able to access another group, people between 20 and 28 years old. All of it was available online and also using a mobile app. So at every project, Victor was very good about putting up the website, and putting up the Twitter handle, and putting up how people could download the app. And consistently we were asking how many people in the room had the app, and more as the process went through, have that right on their phone. At the same time, we were sending out large mass mailings, right? So we sent out over 267,000 emails. And it wasn't really a spam list, it wasn't blind emails. These were people who had participated in some version of something civic-minded. And so it was actually very targeted. Yet, the open rate was still only 22% on all of those, which our media consultant tells us, sounds bad to me, but they said that that was actually very good, and that we were actually reaching a lot of people this way. And they credited the very interesting, splashy graphic design that they used in all of the emails every time people got these announcements. As far as events, we did hands-on workshops and stakeholder meetings. We had various summits throughout the region. We had traveling workshops. Our summits, we brought in national leaders like Dr. Bichelle, Rutgers University, who's speaking quite often here at APA. We brought in local experts. Sam Ferrari was a mayor of Green Acres within the community. And all of our meetings were online and available. People could watch them live. And they're also still available on our website. We've got over 200 different presentations that were given on our website on 750.org. While people were talking at these summits, and these summits sometimes had 600 people or to 800 people, we did this thing where we would break up the presentations. People would hand out these little keypad polling devices, and we would ask questions pertaining to the topic, to what people were speaking about, keypad polling. Just to show you one, for instance. We had over 600 people in the room, and we asked them, did your parents walk to school? We'd ask them to push yes, 1 for yes, or 2 for no. And so, 86% of people said their parents walked to school. Did you walk to school? We'd ask. And the percentage kind of went down, went down quite significantly, actually. And then, of course, what's coming. Do your kids walk to school? And a very small portion did. And right off the bat, right from the top of the room, without even editorializing, there are severe, very important implications, transportation, urban design, and health, implicit in some of the answers that were being projected. We did community image surveys. People would get around tables. They had these large pieces of paper. There's pictures on them. And they would just place red and green dots based on their reaction to those pictures. There were pictures of public spaces and streets and of buildings. And what they didn't know was that the pictures were actually correlated. We were asking them to do a kind of visual preference survey. And then we would tabulate the results before the event was over. So in this case, it was a regional plan, and we had regional issues, but we're also talking about things that matter to ordinary people, the design of streets. And you can see green for the number of green dots and red for the number of red dots. And people like the streets with the ample sidewalks and the street trees and the porches within conversation distance much more than the typical suburban pattern. We handed out one-word cards at the beginning of every event, even small ones. We asked people to fill them out. We gave them something like a half an hour or an hour. And then we went around and we collected all the one-word cards. So one question we asked was one word that comes to mind about Southeast Florida now and in the future, right? And then before it was over, we gathered all the one-word cards from people. We put them into an online program that created word clouds. And we showed people a way of getting sort of pulling the temperature of an entire room immediately. And so in answer to this question, one word that comes to mind about Southeast Florida now, people said disconnected, congested, crowded, disjointed, fragmented. And one word that comes to mind in the future, connected. The bigger the word, the more often the people responded. So connected in this case could have been half the room or a quarter of the room. Sustainable, paradise. At each of the event, we had interactive engagement exercises. Like a big regional map was about 40 feet long. People were drawing their ideas, writing their comments. There's Victor. This is at the very beginning. He got up. We were trying to get it started slow. By the end of it, there was a huge crush of people at the map, which is pretty terrific. We have that scanned and available on the website. Delegate videos, people would walk up to these small terminals. They're called key shot terminals, and they would record messages for the planning team and for the elected officials. We made montages of these. We have these available online. We had informal conversations, 2 kinds of wine, people dressed up. It was a great way to imagine the future. And we did a variety of road shows, mobile workshops, where we packed all this stuff into my wife's little Mini Cooper, our flags and our maps and our poles and our one-word cards, and we drove up and down the region talking about the different ideas that we were getting from the public and talking about the future. And then we went back down, talking to planning directors and elected officials and bouncing the ideas we got from the public off of them, so that way we could start to create policies. Simultaneous with all of this, there were working work groups. Those categories that became the chapter headings for our report, like Victor showed, there were groups working on these. In a way, we were kind of crowdsourcing the report. So economy, climate, development, environment, culture, and leadership. But if you were part of the development group, it wasn't just development. Your group was also dealing with development patterns, transportation, healthy communities. We're trying to mix different spheres and have cross conversations. Well, our first summit, what we did is we got all the regional plans that had been done previously, and we had people actually poll to decide which of the strategies and action items and goals were the most important to them. And that, in a lot of ways, directed our project. Stakeholder meetings, of course. Everyone from, let's say, the Urban Land Institute to Tropical Audubon, or from bicycle clubs to the FDOT. We had over 120 meetings. We focused a lot of the meetings on people that wouldn't ordinarily be part of the conversation. And one thing that happened, at one of our summits, there was a person, and he tweeted, he said, and he has a huge following on Twitter, and he said, where are all the young people, right? He was looking at the crowd and the age group, just didn't seem reflective of the Southeast Florida that he knew. And we had a conversation back with him real time in Twitter, and in the end we resolved, you're right, we need to actually have a different kind of event. So we scheduled what became my favorite event. It was called the New Leaders Millennial Event. We went to Lab Miami, which is a cooperative workspace in Wynwood in the design district of Miami. We got local leaders, and they got up and they talked about the next 50 years. There were no consultants on stage, and we really just took notes and became scribes to, largely planning for these people. It was a really important conversation, and then all of a sudden we started to have, then the tweets started to get out and the Facebook posts, and we were liked and we were followed, and suddenly it was sort of changed the demographic of some of these public meetings. In order to do justice to all the great comments that we got from the public, online and in person, what we did is in the report, we actually included these little silhouettes of people in these little bubbles. So there's the cover of the report, and we would take the verbatim quotes that we got as part of the surveys or online, and we would place them, again, verbatim, unedited, right into the report. We peopled the report with the comments that we got from the public. At the same time, we were doing guest essays with people like the head of the Department of Transportation, District 4 in our case, or our local superintendents. We were getting consensus and getting people involved by allowing them to write their own essays, and we dedicated a page to that. Every time we were presenting numbers, we tried to make splashy, interesting infographics, which were also available online. And then you can see, throughout the whole report, it's a 300-page report, there are people walking around through the different pages talking about the different things that were important to them. The plan dealt with also very large scale, big plans, kind of plans that stir people's souls. We were working on a regional transit network. There are a lot of transit lines that connect the region that are currently moving just freight, or that are really just park and rides with very few trains. And we were working on the idea of locating that 3 million, or a large percentage of them, that's coming to the region into walkable, pedestrian-friendly, transit-oriented places that were connected. And not just that, I mean, we wanted to feed the larger regional rail system with a system of bus rapid transit and trolleys to actually transform a lot of places that were formerly disinvested. On the topic of media, I think the point to make on this, and I really learned it, was when you work with a professional PR group, it's a whole different thing, you know? In my own kind of amateur way, I had always gotten the newspapers involved in our projects or talked to the radio personalities. But when you actually get a PR group, constantly every single week we're in the newspaper, we're recording segments for NPR that traveled, you know, all the way up the East Coast. We were in the Wall Street Journal, we were in the New York Times. Roar Media is who we used, and they were absolutely invaluable to the project. Let's look at the interactive tools. We had the interactive polling. Anytime we did a poll in live group, we also put the poll online. In the future, I'd like Southeast Florida to be. In this case, we had over 800 people answer. Every single week for half of the project, so every single week for about a year, new poll questions would appear. And then people would answer the questions, and the results would pop up. We also created the first data warehouse for the region. So this was an online interactive GIS tool, like we saw in the last session. It's the first one for Florida. You could download these GIS layers in certain places, but you needed ArcGIS in order to look at them. This allowed the public in order to actually look at these different layers. At the same time, we were using a variety of other sort of Google mashup, Google Map products in order to create quicker, kind of slicker, more personable interfaces to ask questions. We had an asset map where people were talking about their businesses in relation to plan goals. And another kind of point that I learned, my background is actually in GIS. And so we went the traditional route with the online Esri product mapper with all of its quirks and rules and non-intuitive kind of things. If we had to do it all again, I think I would just use Google Maps. You'd be able to get GIS data, shape files, put it right onto Google Maps. You're able to create interesting interfaces. And you're able to have not just GIS technicians, but a wide variety of people make these maps and alter these maps. So I recommend that. Now I'm going to show you what I think was for us our favorite tool. This is the online scenario modeler. In order to get people to care about a future that they might not see, you had to create a very vivid picture of what it would look like. And this is what Dave's firm worked on, MetroQuest. So you would go to this first page. You see 5 different tabs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, each with a different color, right? It had to be easy. It had to be something you could get into and out of very quickly. First page talked about the project. They go to that second tab, open up the second tab, and they saw various regional values. And what they did is they moved the ones that were most important to them up to the top, a top 5 list. And there's a discussion as they clicked on each one of these bubbles. So I did this, you know, ranking less driving overall as a #1 priority. But we tried to have both sides of the discussion, so lower taxes and let's see, keep my neighborhood as it is, large homes with big yards, all that was also part of the conversation. And people could create their own priorities. And they tweeted to each other other priorities, which was interesting. They then were asked the big questions about growth and planning in the region. Grow how? More greenfield, more infield, more infill. How should we invest in transportation? Highways or more multimodal? How seriously should we take, or how much should we invest in climate change? High priority, low priority. Once they answered these questions, different scenarios would then appear. We created multiple scenarios, and the one that most closely fit with their answers then came up on the screen. And what the tool does is it actually talked about their priorities in terms of things getting better or worse, and to what degree that scenario would actually further their goals. People were able to rate the future. They were able to comment on it. And then at the end, they then would put in some information about themselves, and then in a way vote on one of the scenarios. They could also compare. Excuse me one second. Using Dave's tool, they were also able to compare their goals versus other ones, other votes that we had received. So less driving overall was a #1 priority for me, and it was a #7 priority for people at this time of the poll, which is kind of interesting. The online tool was very quick and abbreviated. There was actually a quite detailed scenario tool that was created, or a report that was created for the region, which could be the subject of a whole other session. We got into much more complexity. The tool allowed people to access the report, and we saw a lot of people traveling from the tool to the larger annotated, footnoted report, which talked about a whole variety of other issues like infrastructure costs or the housing transportation connection. The tool also allowed people to zoom into specific areas. So this is zoomed into Broward County. Broward County in southeast Florida is where Fort Lauderdale is. And they're able to look at how things would change under different scenarios. You can see in this scenario, the water's rising up on the west coast, on the west portion, sea level rise. It's making its way east. The barrier islands are in trouble without resilience infrastructure, without investment. Population is thus, new population is thus going into the transit-oriented development areas. There's a ladder system to feed larger regional systems. We also had a series of x-rays, so that way people could look at these scenarios in terms of specific questions, like the question of walkability. So if this is existing conditions in Broward County, we used, by the way, the walk score methodology. Mostly it's a lot of red, very car dependent. There are tiny little pockets of often walkable, little neighborhoods, places where you could walk to, potentially, possibly, to a park or to a corner store. And then we showed how under the different scenarios, the walkability of the region could change. And you see big green Fort Lauderdale turning into a real city, you know, as part of the scenario. As I said, people voted on the scenarios. The zooming in was really important because, you know, when you put an area as large as Florida up on a like this, it's impossible to see the difference between the different places. 73% voted for a scenario we call region in motion. We also, I think with this project, learned, we created a quick film, and we might even have a chance to show that to you today. It was a 15-minute film. We created it in 9 days. We worked with First and Main, an excellent media company. We got major decision makers like District Secretary of the DOT or the Mayor of Monroe County and the Florida Keys. We worked with them on the script in those 9 days. We drove to their offices or to their favorite place, and we actually filmed them and interviewed them and made this project. And really quickly, this film, you know, had 1,000 hits on YouTube, and it continues to grow. And we also could watch that people were going from the film to the actual report. So instead of, you know, in lieu of reviewing the report, the film was actually helping to get the word out, and people were spending more time with the other products we created. So if you put it all together, the Facebook and the Twitter and the public events and the online modeler and the polls that we did, this was a process that in one way or another reached 1 million people in a region that has 6. So that's not too bad. Dr. Burchell, who we worked with, said that the most important thing that we did was we hosted a regional conversation that went on for 2 years. You know, we needed to get the word out about some very difficult topics. We needed to involve everybody. Dr. Burchell says in the report that the world isn't changed, the world isn't saved by 2 or 3 people. Everyone that needs to be involved. Thank you very much.
Welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. What I'd like to do is just give a little bit of a background in terms of how we came up with what we came up with in terms of online engagement tools and our thinking behind it. One of the reasons why I'd like to tell this story is the privilege that we had back in the 90s we had an affiliation with a major research project that was granted $10 million to think about how to improve things like public engagement. And can you imagine how ahead of our time we felt when we were recommending online engagement in 1995? But things have really shifted and can't come around. What that gave us is the opportunity to really think quite deeply about some things. And I think one of the most important things that the researchers in that project decided was not to start with technology, not to start with engineering or analysis, but to start with psychology. The psychology, and so one of the names of the presentation might be the psychology of public engagement. So when we were looking at this problem and we were looking at the challenge of engaging the public, and since we've been working on this now in the real world for the better part of 17 years, we've seen this pattern reproduce itself over and over. The public is not homogeneous. It's not just one group of the same type of people. There's essentially three, from the perspective of engagement, there's essentially three different types of groups that are out there in every community that we're in. The first one is a tiny little dot. And this, we lovingly refer to these people as STP. This is the same 10 people. These are the usual suspects, the people who show up to absolutely everything. The amount of effort it takes to engage them is practically nil. There's almost nothing that you can do without them showing. And they're a very unique, and you're all very aware of it, a bunch of folks. And when we widen the circle a little bit more, we start to bring in stakeholders. And these are people by association with some sort of cause, a group, or employment are interested in what's going on. The vast majority of the time when we talk about engaging the public, we're talking about engaging these two groups of people. The next group, the rest of the population, some 99% of the population, we just call the general public. It takes an extreme amount of finesse or thought in order to engage them, because when we look at what they are like, the characteristics of these folks, we find that they're very aloof. Now, no offense to planning, but these folks are just not interested in planning, and there is nothing that we can do to make the workshop more interesting enough that they'll actually come. They have a passing interest in planning at best. Probably have never been on a municipal website, an MPO website, even know what one is, let alone visit them. The idea of coming to a workshop or something like that is beyond the pale for these folks, and we just have to deal with it. Secondly, they're very busy doing all kinds of other things. They've just got different other interests on their mind. When we actually pin them into the corner and say, hey, there's a corridor plan or an area plan that's affecting your neighborhood, why aren't you involved? The answer might often be, well, I don't know anything about transportation planning. I don't know anything about it. Honey, what do you think? You know, just sort of thinking that you need actually professional training to have an opinion about your neighborhood or your transportation needs and so forth. So, feeling quite disconnected. They just don't see themselves as participants. Many of them don't even vote in elections, let alone do anything in between elections to participate. So they just don't feel like part of the decision-making structure or part of the democracy. As a result, they're very misjudged. We are all living in a bubble where we don't know what these people think. How on earth would we? When have we spoken with them? We've made it politically incorrect for people to share their values with their neighbors, let alone anybody else. And these are the most disconnected members of society. So when we think about the bubble that we're all in, this bubble is shared by politicians. It's shared by everyone because we just don't have any mechanism for engaging with these folks. So the real question is, how do we engage with these people? What are the criteria or the mechanisms that we can use to get at them? So we have, over the years, come up with, and that's a part of this research project and beyond, a bit of a prescription for what it takes, how high the bar is to engage with these folks. The first thing is, it's got to be fast. And when we ask these people, hey, have you got 10 minutes? Many of them will say no. That's when it starts to drop off dramatically. Have you got 5 minutes to participate in something? Yes, maybe I've got 5 minutes if it's really compelling. The bar is so high in terms of the amount of time that these people are willing to spend. The idea of a workshop is, as I said, beyond the pale. So 5-minute experience, that's your kind of budget, that's your target to engage large numbers. The second is when you're engaging people online, you're competing with everything else on the internet. Have you seen the internet? Do you know what's out there? These are things that people could look at instead of looking at what you're showing them. And remember, they're not that interested in planning. So it has to be fun. You have to compete out there for amusement and entertainment. You have to make it visual and interesting and dynamic. Thirdly, there can be no instructions needed. If you've only got 5 minutes, certainly somebody who's uninterested is not going to spend 4 minutes learning how to do the thing. They'll be gone in 10 seconds. So something that's so easy that you can just look at it and start playing around and start getting some useful things out of it is absolutely required. And fourthly, and perhaps equally importantly, I should say, meaningful. And meaningful really has 2 dimensions. The first one is it has to be educational enough so we know that the input that we're gathering from them is informed about the trade-offs associated with different choices. Secondly, in order for it to resonate with them, it has to be relevant to themselves and their family's needs. So using language and priorities that they would resonate with. So when we look at all of these things together, we realize how daunting this task is. We've got to pack a crash course in planning into 5 minutes with an interface that requires no instruction, and we've got to make it fun like a game. So that's our bar, and I mean, because we were starting out with a $10 million research project, we actually could experiment and try a few things. And so I'd love to show you a little bit about what we came up with. So first off, in order to engage large numbers of people, we need to provide multiple venues for them to participate. So obviously, web-based engagement is critical. But it turns out that web-based engagement is only really that critical if people are willing to share what they've done with their colleagues and their friends on social networks. If they don't, then you're dragging people one at a time to your process, and it ends up being quite challenging to get large numbers. So we put through the filter of shareability every configuration that goes out the door. Is this something that people would share with other people on Twitter and Facebook and so forth? When you do that, when you pass that test, people do your legwork for you and share it amongst their colleagues and friends. Secondly, we've actually had great experiences with these types of kiosks. You can put them in a community center or in a recreation center and engage large numbers of people. But here's the trick, if and only if you get them in the right location. You can't put them in transit station. Nobody feels like they have any time to spare in a transit station. Even if they're going to be waiting for 10 minutes, they don't know that. They're looking at their watch, they're waiting for the train. But you move them to a library or a recreation center where they're waiting for their child to get changed, and all of a sudden they're looking at lost cat notices on the wall. This fun kiosk looks like actually something to kill some time. There's a variety of other mechanisms, devices out there to engage, and this photo here, I love this photo. This woman has gone to a community event where there's an underrepresented demographic, where people were just not engaging in this demographic online, and she's taken 6 iPads and she's engaging people, sort of getting them started. Hey, can I get you started with that, and getting them rolling. What we like to recommend is don't spend all your money on workshops and then run out and figure out that we're missing huge sectors of the demographic. Engage people online and figure out who we're missing, and then spend the boots on the ground effort to fill in the gaps. Go to community events and so forth and fill in the gaps of people who are not participating in other ways. Now, Victor mentioned that I have an announcement, and I do. We've added a very important channel to this. It's taken us quite some time because, as you'll see, the tool is incredibly visual and flexible. We have now added online engagement through mobile phones. We expect this to be a very important channel. People expect to be able to access these things through phones. We had quite a challenge with it because fitting everything into that interface and being thumb friendly and so forth, so we're very proud of this announcement. There's a variety of different types of planning projects where we've found that this has been effective on a variety of land use and transportation, NEPA plans and EIS processes and so forth. Before I jump into this sort of rapid fire examples that I wanted to get into, I wanted to introduce the concept of a library of screen types, because it's really important to the way we like to be responsive to the needs of each project, because every project is different. And so we've got this library of screen types built up where we can mix and match, almost like digital Lego, which combination is going to make sense for each phase of the process. So there's always a welcome screen at the beginning. There's always a thank you screen at the end, as Jason showed. Then the ones in the middle can be selected from a fairly vast list of different types of interactivity, ranking priorities, putting comments on maps, doing visual preference surveys, voting on different scenarios or visualizations, looking at different strategies and voting on them, even balancing budgets and playing coin games. There's a variety of things that you might want to do throughout the course of a planning process to engage people. And how we like to work is to sit down with the team and figure out what information needs to be collected, and then we'll work together to figure out what the most fun way of collecting that vital information is going to be. How are we going to make it most interesting for people to provide it? So instead of asking people multiple choice questions, can we do something like a visual preference survey, or have them rank things or vote on different aspects in a kind of a fun and visual way? I'm going to switch over now to a browser where I've got opened up a number of different examples here. I'll show you the first one in a little bit of detail, and then I'll go fairly quickly through the rest, and I'll be happy to share those links with you so you can play around yourselves when you get home. So here's an example of a project that we worked on in Florida, in the Tampa area. So the first screen that people would see is a welcome screen that gives people some examples of what's going on in the project, and then encourages them to engage. Then we've got a ranking screen where people just touch these things and in priority order just tell us what's most important to them. Now, I mentioned psychology was built right into this. The psychology of this is asking the right question. When you ask people what's important to them, they get the sense that this is actually about them and their needs. It's the most important question you can ask to start engaging someone. What's most important to them? And then from then on, shape everything that they see downstream from that based on what they've told you about their priorities. The second interactive screen here is looking at different scenarios. There's 3 different scenarios of how Tampa could evolve. You see each one of these has a visualization and some imagery, and you can also see the pros and cons of the alternative based on your top priorities. So here I can see that this one does well on my top priority, but poorly on my number 2 and number 3. You can go ahead and give it a rating, make comments about it, and so forth. This one also has a very quick visual preference survey where you can go through different examples of, for example, housing options and rate them. You've got different job areas and transportation modes and so forth, and even a quick survey about how are we going to pay for all of this. The last interactive screen is tell us a little bit about yourself and where are we in the over the course of the project, where are we in the planning process, who are the responsible agencies and so forth, and the all-important share screen to encourage people to help spread the word. You see that this one is available in English and Spanish, so people can toggle back and forth between them. So now what I'll do is I'll just show you some of my favorite screens, just to show you some of the functionality. It won't be comprehensive, but you'll get the idea of the flexibility of how we need to respond to the different needs of different projects. So here, the reason I like this one, this is a mobility plan for a Los Angeles community. The reason I like this one is it allows people to say, hey, bicycle safety is a real issue, and it's a real issue right around this high school. One of the reasons why I like it is there's a catharsis that's built into that. right? People like to get off their chest things that are happening in their neighborhood. They like to pinpoint things. Even if it's not critical for you and your planning process to have people do that, it's important for them to be able to do that, to feel like they're getting heard and they're getting some things expressed.
Plus, they're giving you close-up, site-specific information that can translate into a regional interpretation.
Well, exactly. I really like that. It's a great point, Victor. I really like using this type of screen at the beginning of a process, at the first phase of a process, because then in the next phase, when you're actually creating alternatives, it can be informed based on these comments that come in about problems in different areas, so you can hone in on some of the things that you've heard in the first phase. This one is a corridor plan for a highway along the coastline of California, the Pacific Coast Highway. Many of you probably, if you've visited California, you've probably been on it. It goes through Malibu, California. One of the reasons I like this one is it allows people to pinpoint where improvements are needed very specifically. You can go in and say, hey, you know what, we need a crosswalk right there. In fact, large numbers of people suggested that they needed a crosswalk right there. I've discovered that there's a great surfing spot right off the coast, and the only place to park is on the other side of the highway, so you can only imagine what's happening along that busy road. But certainly that kind of interactivity allows you to hone in the second phase with scenario information that's built off that community involvement. I also like it because there's a lot of different icons on here. What if we had collected, in this case, I don't know, how many thousands of recommendations from the community? What if we only had what improvements are you going to recommend? Probably people like you would have to go through one at a time and figure out, is this person talking about a crosswalk, or are they talking about speed problems or parking? So having people self-identify what category it is allows you to do your GIS spatial analysis and say, show me all of the crosswalk recommendations, and they cluster in different areas, and it makes the reporting process that much easier. This one's interesting because it allows people to essentially build their own neighborhood. They can allocate different types of growth in different areas. Where does transit-oriented development belong, and it adds up how many people you've allocated based on the growth projections to the map. So that's an interesting one for people that really like to play with different types of development. This one is a cycling plan. It allows people to put in where they live, where they work, and how they get around by bicycle, and it allows them to drag this around to designate what routes they take. This city really wanted to figure out where the improvements were needed in the cycling network. This is a long-range transportation vision for Flagstaff, Arizona. The reason I like this one is when you get to a scenario that you really like, this one does really well on my top priorities, I can go ahead and give it a nice rating. I can also, because it's in Google, I can zoom right in on it and mark it up and say, you know what, I like this, but I don't like what's being recommended right here. Because what often happens, I'm sure you know, because you work with alternatives, what happens often is there's a blending of the preferred scenario based on a couple of scenarios that people have suggested. And so collecting comments back about what they like and dislike about different aspects supports that process. This is a project that's going on in San Francisco about rainwater and stormwater and green and gray water infrastructure. Shares with people some of the performance metrics of different types of covers and asks them which ones they like and would recommend for their neighborhood. I like this one because it uses visualizations really nicely. It's a town center that's being recreated. And these images we're going to wind up on posters in a public involvement session. And what we did is we put them online so people could go around to the different visualizations, see the impacts, and vote on them. I also really like this visual preference survey because it's a town center. People really wanted to weigh in on what types of building options people like. I don't like that one. I like this one. Again, really quick, but you can capture rich information because you're using images which convey information very quickly for people. This one, small community center, you can look at different options and weigh in on them. When you're looking at smaller sites like this, you can actually look at different visualizations and see how they perform and get people's reaction to them. Obviously, you can't do this for Greater Tampa because we can't visualize at that scale. We need to visualize in plan view or in the South Florida example. But when you're dealing with a small community or a TOD development, oftentimes visualizations can really be rich for people. Now, I mentioned, just a few more here, I mentioned in my introduction about strategies and how people could vote on different strategies. This is kind of a trick to get people to read. We've turned it into a tiny little bit of a game, and it turns out you don't need to do that much to get people to go through things. If we had to put it in a document, there's 35 different strategies, and try to get people to read them, it might have been difficult. But this one is just asking people thumbs up and thumbs down about these different ideas. Which one's your favorite? Do you want to suggest anything that's missing, and so forth, in different categories. Turns out that amount of functionality is actually enough to get people to go through 25 or 30 different things. The last few are related to funding. Increasingly, we're getting asked to get involved in the discussion about cost and funding and budgeting. No surprise based on the austerity measures that many situations are in right now. This one is a transportation plan where you can essentially vote on which transportation projects you want to fund. You see that I've spent $45 million so far based on a total budget of $285 million. So away I go, and I can keep spending more. I can, of course, get myself into trouble very quickly and have to start making some trade-offs. There again, people are self-discovering that there's limits in place, and then they're playing the game that you want them to play, as opposed to something where there's no accountability measures, where people can recommend everything. You know, people show up to public meetings, and we've seen this time and time again. I want a short drive to work on uncongested streets with low taxes and blah, 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 right? You know, you think, pick something. It's all connected. And so having people play the accountability game and look at the trade-offs associated with different alternatives, if you can do it in a quick way, can really help enliven the conversation to a level that's a little bit more sophisticated. I like this one because it basically asks people to nominate the mechanisms that they would like to suggest for raising the funds to improve transportation. So here are all the things that we could use to pay for transportation for this community. And as we go over to the budget section here, there's the 5 things that I said were the mechanisms that I would use to balance the budget, and we're given a challenge of $2 billion annually. How are we going to do that? So you can start raising money thusly, and you realize very quickly that some things just don't do anything at all. Right? This one is completely useless, but turns out I've picked wisely. We don't need it. We can balance the budget using other mechanisms. So there, with these mechanisms, I've easily balanced the budget. Turns out these things can be enormously popular. I think we attracted 12,500 people in 4 or 5 weeks to this one, and really does change the nature of the kinds of conversations that people are having, because it's about which mechanisms are most appropriate, as opposed to the finger pointing and bun fighting that often happens. That's completely unproductive and just builds up animosity. I just came from a presentation where the organizations that were doing this project were presenting in another room. This is the Move DC plan. I don't know if any of you were at that presentation, but they did a great job talking about how people were helping to create the new transportation vision for DC. Here we're looking at a variety of different alternatives. You can see the performance of those alternatives, and you can actually navigate around to different modes and see the impact of different scenarios based on your mode of choice. I thought that was quite clever. And then I think they use this coin game in a very interesting way. You're essentially allowed to kind of allocate budget to different areas to express how important you think it is on different aspects. So I thought that was an interesting way of combining priority setting with an idea around the mechanisms that people would use to fund it. And I want to thank you very much for your attention today. We'd be happy to field any questions or conversation about what you've seen today. Thank you.